reading is from a blog entry entitled 9 Points to Ponder on the Paris Shooting and Charlie Hebdo by Omid Safi, who is a Muslim scholar at Duke University. 2, yes, this is partially about freedom of speech. Satire, especially political satire, is a time-honored tradition. Satire at its best is a political tool to invert hierarchies, to disturb and unsettle. Being unsettled and disturbed is necessary for education, education of individuals and education of communities. Unsettling is never smooth or graceful. Let us not make saints out of satirists, some of whom fostered racist cartoons, none of whom deserved this fate, all of whom should be mourned. Let us have the integrity to say that the killed satirists spent their lives tearing down sacred icons. Let us in their death not turn the satirists into the very sacred icons they opposed their whole life. Here's the thing about freedom of speech. There are few red lines left. In an age where almost anyone can get his or her writings published online, blocking or censoring anyone has become all but impossible. Yes, freedom of speech includes the right to offend. Yet, I wonder if our willingness to celebrate the right to offend also extends to us reaching out in compassion to those who are offended. I also wonder what we do when the freedom to offend is not applied equally across the board, but targets again and again communities that are marginalized and ostracized. So how does one counter offensive words and images? Had the shooters in Paris actually bothered opening the Quran, they would have known about, quote, repel evil with something that is lovelier, unquote. Had they sought to embody the Quran, they wouldn't have shot down cartoonists, but made sure to shoot down prejudice by embodying luminous qualities that would transform the society, one person at a time. No laughing matter. Charlie Hebdo. I decided Friday morning that I could not go forward with the sermon I had planned about the fallibility of memory, because the events in Paris had cut close to my bone, and I thought they would be cutting close to yours. In such circumstances, I think a minister is called to offer some thoughts about how our religious values intersect with what we are hearing and reading. Here are the basic facts. Charlie Hebdo, the word hebdo is a contraction of hebdomadaire, or weekly, is a satirical weekly newspaper published in Paris. It is known for cartoons and features which are offensive to many groups, including Muslims. Last Wednesday, Saeed and Sharif Kouachi, two brothers who were French-born Muslims of Algerian descent, stormed the office in Paris and killed the editor and many of the cartoonists and other employees, including one security guard who was a Muslim. They got away, but were tracked down by police to a printing plant in a suburb of Paris on Friday. They took a hostage, and for a while there was a standoff. On Thursday, in another area near Paris, Amedi Koulibaly, another Muslim of African descent, had a shootout which left one policewoman dead. And on Friday, he attacked a kosher grocery store just before sundown on the Sabbath, when it was crowded with Jewish shoppers. He killed 4 customers and took the rest hostage, demanding that the police give the Kouachi brothers their freedom. For a while, there were 2 hostage standoffs 30 miles apart. When the 2 brothers released their hostage, they came out shooting and were killed by police without further injury to the police or civilian hostages. At the grocery store, police stormed the site and killed the gunman without any further casualties, but his female accomplice apparently escaped. All in all, 20 people have died in these related incidents. Both brothers had been known to the police. Sharif Kouachi had been arrested in 2005 in connection with a plot to go to Iraq and join the insurgency there. But this was not just a casual idea of a couple of disaffected Parisian young men. The Al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen has issued a statement claiming that they planned and directed the operation. And as of this morning, the New York Times says that the President of France has declared war on radical Islam. My first reaction is to agree with Omid Safi, the man who wrote the piece I just read, that we mourn the dead, the 20 people killed in this incident. Whatever it may have been about, 20 human beings are dead. Now, to put that figure in perspective, on the same day that the Kouachi brothers stormed the offices in Paris, a suicide bomber drove a minivan into a crowd of police cadets at the police academy in Sana'a, Yemen, and blew himself up, killing 37 people, most of whom were police recruits, reported for their first day of training. No one claimed responsibility for the bombing, but the Al-Qaeda branch in Yemen has done similar things in the past. Is this about free speech? Maybe it isn't. Or maybe thinking about it as being about free speech just plays into a terrorist agenda. Maybe it should be basically seen as a couple of thugs committing a heinous crime with a high symbolic value, through which they hope to further widen tensions between France's Muslim population, the highest in Europe, and the French citizenry. I know one thing. I feel in solidarity with the victims, and I yield to no one in my embrace of free speech, but I'm not going to put a bumper sticker on my car saying, "Je suis Charlie Hebdo." Murder is not and can never be a response to an offensive publication, but from what I have read, this magazine was well beyond taste, and I don't think my defense of free speech requires me to actually embrace a publication I may find abhorrent. I will defend it against the government attempt to shut it down, but that does not require me to suggest that anyone here should take out a subscription. David Brooks made a similar point in the New York Times recently. Healthy societies, he said, don't suppress speech, but they do grant different standing to different sorts of people. Wise and considerate scholars are heard with high respect. Satirists are heard with bemused semi-respect. Racists and anti-Semites are heard through a filter of opprobrium and disrespect. People who want to be heard attentively have to earn it through their conduct, unquote. As many of you know, I was active with the ACLU for 20 years and did my best to vigorously support freedom of expression, and became used to the paradox that this support often put me in the position of supporting speech with which I had basic disagreements. We lived by the mantra that the remedy for bad speech was not suppression or punishment of the speech, but more speech, good speech. In our fourth New Year principle, we covenant to affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. On both the Unitarian and Universalist sides of our history, we are a post-Enlightenment religion, and we embrace the liberal value that truth emerges from a clash of ideas, not from the dictate of any authority. Responsible speech advances the search for truth more than irresponsible speech, but the freedom of both must be protected against censorship. But freedom of speech does not mean that speech does not have consequences. Do you remember that old playground verse? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Nothing could be further from the truth. Most of the psychological hurt that most of us get in our lives comes by way of words. Speech may be free in a formal sense, but it can be costly. Words wound, and particularly is this the case with humor. Now, all of you know I have a great sense of humor. I think laughter is one of the greatest gifts of human life, and I will often look for the humor in any situation in order to avoid being overwhelmed by it. But there are some things clearly which are no laughing matter. When Frank sang Charlie on the MTA this morning, I was reminded of a parody of that written by Robbie Walsh. Alan Brooks and I went up to Hingham to participate in Robbie Walsh's open sing-around on Tuesday night, and he's doing well. He was a minister in Duxbury for many, many years. But he contributed to Peter Rabel's parody volume a wonderful little takeoff on Charlie on the MTA called The Committee That Never Adjourned. Did they ever adjourn? No, they never adjourned. It's all about you, parish life. I will lift up with no small sense of irony a couple of jokes to make my point about humor. One day, Jesus and Moses were having a game of golf, and as divine beings, they could choose a famous course. There was one particularly difficult hole on the course that they chose, a water hole that requires one shot to get the ball over a pond. Jesus looked at the shot and selected a 6-iron. Moses said, Jesus, don't you want a 4-iron or less? You'll never make it across the pond with a 6-iron. Jesus replied, I've watched Jack Nicklaus shoot this hole, and he always uses a 6-iron. So Jesus swings, and the ball arcs up and then falls plop into the pond. Moses says, hey, I'll let you take that one over. So Jesus walks out on the water, reaches down, and retrieves the ball, and comes back. All this is being watched by a golfer on the side. When Jesus walks on the water, the golfer says to Moses, who does that fellow think he is? Jesus Christ? And Moses replies, oh, he knows he's Jesus Christ. He thinks he's Jack Nicklaus. Some of you may be offended by that joke right here, and particularly by a minister telling it. And there are definitely people outside these walls who would be offended today. But if my memory serves me well, I heard that joke told in a public speech by the Catholic Archbishop of Charleston at a St. Patrick's ceremony back in the 1980s. And I'll contrast that with a joke from roughly the same era in my life. How many feminists does it take to change a light bulb? The answer? That's not funny. Now, these jokes from the 80s would not have been told in the 60s. The Catholic Archbishop would have felt it his public duty to uphold the sacredness of Jesus would be denigrated by a telling a joke on Jesus, particularly one where Jesus, the omnipotent being, is envying the skill of a human sports figure. To those who feel that their veneration of Jesus is inconsistent with jokes featuring Jesus, the joke itself would give offense. And in the 60s, the joke about feminism would have made no sense at all. But let's look at that joke a little closer. It's a little anxious, because it's a reaction to a basic contention of feminism of the first wave, that humor is part of the way the male patriarchy maintains dominance. Feminists said that women won't be culturally equal until jokes about boobs and bimbos and beauty queens land in the same cultural trash heap as the old jokes about blacks and watermelon. I say the joke is anxious because it reflects an undercurrent of wanting to hold on to all those jokes the feminists didn't think were funny anymore. What does humor have to do with power and social status? Plenty. Anthropologists go to traditional villages and study joking relationships in order to figure out the status hierarchy. Generally, most people joke only with someone of lower or equal status, and not with someone of higher status. The king can joke with everyone, but nobody jokes with the king, except the jester. And he's specially designated for this occasion. A good jester also knows there are limits to his jibes. Remember the jester in Hamlet? He appears only as a skald. Perhaps he told the wrong joke. If we take this principle to the group level, any given group can laugh at groups that are lower status, but not higher status. And where a group is constantly the butt of humor, whether it be Muslims, Roman Catholics, African Americans, women, gays, lesbians, transgender folks, that serves to reinforce in the dominant culture that group's inferiority, which is why activists trying to change the culture, often care about humor, care about the jokes which are being told. And this activism over the course of decades has brought us progress. The jokes I've used for illustration here are capable of giving offense to certain people today, and it's probable that most of them would not be told in public. But we can all recall much more offensive jokes that we heard earlier in our lives, but would never pass our lips today. Jokes whose point is to denigrate a racial or sexual orientation group. And there's a natural way that the crude and cruel jokes of yesteryear have died out in American culture. People stopped laughing. We don't need to pass laws governing what jokes you can tell or publish. We simply stop laughing and stop buying the magazines publishing this humor. You have no incentive to tell a joke if people are not going to laugh. You have no incentive to publish satire if people aren't going to buy it. One of the ironic consequences of this whole affair is that Charlie Hebdo is planning to sell 1 million copies of its next edition on sympathy, when its regular circulation had been much less. The point I'm trying to get to is that while we, as religious people, embrace free speech, we also embrace responsible and sensitive speech, inclusive speech. Humor is a type of speech, and humor has the power to lift up a person or group, or put down a person or group. It has the power to draw a circle that keeps anyone out, or draws anyone in. Have you ever tried to understand a joke in a foreign culture? You may know enough French or Japanese to be able to order a meal in a French or Japanese restaurant, but you can't consider yourself fluent in the language unless you can understand the jokes the wait staff are telling each other. When we tell in-jokes anywhere around this meeting house, we're excluding our visitors who may not be in on them. So the joke, the circle of the joke, the circle of who gets the joke, defines a social unit. And we, as Universalists, from the Universalist side of our heritage, are committed to being as inclusive as possible. So we're in favor of free speech. But free speech has the power to divide us, the power to keep the marginalized at the margins. Remember the comment from Omid Safi, the American Muslim I quoted a moment ago. Yes, freedom of speech includes the right to offend. Yet I wonder if our willingness to celebrate the right to offend also extends to us reaching out in compassion to those who are offended. I also wonder what we do when the freedom to offend is not applied equally across the board, but targets again and again communities that are marginalized and ostracized. Unquote. We recognize that there's a tension between freedom and equality, and yet we do not choose between them. We want both. There are no across-the-board solutions to terrorism, but France would reduce the appeal of this type of fame to young Muslim men if those men could see a future for themselves within French society. When Sharif Karachi was arrested in 2005 for terrorist activities, his lawyer described him in these words, quote, "He lived his entire life in France, and was not particularly religious. He drank, smoked pot, slept with his girlfriend, and delivered pizzas for a living. Unquote. This is the stuff of which homegrown terrorists are made. Not the deeply religious, but the secular disaffected. From an American perspective, it is peculiar for France to rally around freedom of expression in this instance, when the government has forbidden Muslim girls to wear the hijab head covering at school, which is certainly an aspect of expression which is both very personal and very inoffensive as far as I know. The last thing I want to say about this is to caution us from sliding into stereotypes. The perpetrators of this crime may have wanted to start a holy war against the secular West, but it's not a clash of civilizations unless we choose to see it that way. Islam is not a monolithic organization, and many Muslim societies have a rich tradition of satire. It is not the ironic post-Christian secular West against the earnest, primitive Muslim world. Muslims laugh. Muslims poke fun at each other. Nor is Islam even uniformly opposed to depictions of Muhammad. And let us remember that speech must be tolerated in order for our society to remain free is often not the healthiest speech in society. Let us extend to Muslims worldwide our sympathy for the offense caused by the satire, whose right to publish we may defend, but whose content we do not have to. Amen.